So, when we talk about inflation, it's, you know, some people can get the example of an orange, but now I want to just expand a little bit more about the inflationary impacts on you and on your life. Because the bottom line is this. That chart showed from 1960. This chart goes back 300 years. It's a really neat thing to notice here, because this chart basically explains the amount of out of controlness that's going on right now in our current system. 1665 to 2000, and this actually goes to 2009. On this side of the chart, we've got the Consumer Price Index. Okay, how many people have ever heard of the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index? Who has not? All right, cool. Very simple explanation of the CPI, or Consumer Price Index, is basically what it is. It's a group of like apples, oranges, bananas, gasoline, and you throw it in a basket, and they say that's, in this particular year, the cost of all those basket of goods is what is required for, you know, as an indication of the quality of life. So if a banana was, you know, 20 a cent back here, and the whole basket came down to about $1, then we could say back in 1665, the quality of life to get all those necessities of life was about $1. So this chart says it sets 1982 to 84 at a value of 100. That's why if you look at 82 here, it crosses 100. So prior to 1982, it was less than 100. After 82 is more than 100. So all CPI is a measure of the quality of life, marked by the price of goods. So here's a really cool thing to notice about this chart. 1665, right about to 1910, 1915, 1914. That's right.
Look up, Claire.
1914. That's where the black dot is. Correct. You're right. So for about 245 years, inflation hardly ever rose. There might have been a blip here because that was the War of 1812. That was the Revolutionary War. Here's the Civil War. Okay, so after a major war, inflation creeps up, but it comes back down. Here in the War of 1812, inflation goes up, but it returns back to historical levels. Civil War goes up, but it returns back. Okay? Now, for almost 250 years, the cost of living has literally remained unchanged. Even after war, the cost of living still comes back to what it was 200 years ago. So then what happens in 1914? What happened in 1914? First World War. So First World War happens, again after war, massive inflationary impact, you get this blip. That's all fine and dandy. But then something else happens over here in 1933. 1933, Roosevelt issues an executive order, confiscates gold, essentially takes the US off of the gold standard, because he now takes all the gold from the American population and repegs the price of gold from $20.67 to $35 an ounce. Notice there's no return to the historical cost of living after World War I and once the US was taken off the gold standard back in 1933. Over here, when the US was taken off the gold standard, check out what happens to inflation. Steady, steady rise. Okay? Even right through World War II. Because at this point in World War II now, the US is the world reserve currency, and all the other world currencies are pegged to the US dollar. And inflation's rising. That means the US dollar is losing value. It got to a point that in 1971, all the rest of the world were saying, wow, the US has all this gold. Man, we're gonna trade in all of our US dollar reserves and get the gold out of Fort Knox. And in 1971, President Nixon said, that is not cool. That is so not cool. We're gonna cut that out. We're gonna say no more exchanging US dollars for gold. And that marks the end, the official end. So Roosevelt took the US off the gold standard. Nixon took the world off the gold standard in 1971. Ever since then, look what happens to inflation. Because now the US dollar is not backed by anything tangible. For all these years, close to 250 years, the US dollar was backed by gold or silver. Now, since 1971, not backed by anything, just a promise. It's backed by the confidence that the world has in the US. That's been going on since 1971. Okay?
What year were you born in, Glenn?
78.
Okay, good, just checking.
So now, well then, what happens here? Remember we're talking about CPI? In 1980, the accountants in the US got really creative. Actually, the accountants in the world got really creative. And they said, we're going to fudge the way that we calculate CPI. So that now there would be a suppression in the inflation. So this red line denotes the official reported inflation rate since 1980. That takes into account the fudging of the books. This black line here shows inflation if there were no fudging. So this graph comes from shadowstats.com. This dude with ShadowStats, Robert Sarr, has made it his life's mission to figure out all the policy changes to the way that the US represents its statistics and back calculates so he can use the pre-fudged numbers. So ever since 1980, he's been tracking inflation. And this is the actual inflation up till 2009. But the inflation that's reported in the media would show this in 2009. If we were to include the euro backing and ensuring the bailout of Greece, this chart would be off the chart. If we started taking into account, the Federal Reserve, once they start printing more and more money, this won't even just go off the chart. This will be out in, we're clear through the roof. So the point is, that's not stopping. But what does that mean to you? If CPI is the measure of the cost of living, and we're here, what that means is just in the span of 10 years, we are working 10 times as hard to make the same amount of money that will buy us less. You get that? Okay, I'm going to say that again because a lot of people miss this because this graphic looks pretty neat, but they don't get the implication on their life. How many of you are noticing your salaries are increasing with inflation? Is your salary, are you getting raises every year?
Oh yeah.
Just Vodek is. Right? Most people, their wages haven't increased. So what that means is, if your wages aren't increasing, but inflation is, you're making the same amount of money, but the paper money that you're making is consistently being worth less and less and less. So that's why you start to see people nowadays get second, third, fourth jobs. They get the other spouse. It's actually commonplace now to have two parents working. As soon as a kid hits 14, they're doing a paper route. They're paying for their own DS. You know what I mean? Because we're working twice, 3 times, 5 times, 10 times as hard at multiple jobs to generate more income so that we could just stay afloat with our current lifestyle. That's not good or bad, okay? It's just reality. It just doesn't work. I don't know about you, but that doesn't work for me. Again, it's not. I'm not one of these people who are like, oh yeah, we should end all government. We should, go back to whatever. I'm not one of those guys. I'm just one of the guys who want to educate people on what's happening so that you can make informed choices and not just go on what your neighbor tells you, what your banker tells you, what CNN tells you. Because when they're reporting inflation here, but it's authentically here, I want you to hear this. That's an order of magnitude of greater than 10. That you're working longer hours trying to make more money to scrape by. Okay? Again, not good or bad, just doesn't work for the kind of lifestyle I know I'm not committed to. And I'd venture a guess that since y'all are here, part of the Toronto business leaders, you're not committed to that either. So, like I said, authentic, the official US stats for inflation is here. If you follow shadow stats, we're more like here. If we were to include the bailouts in the Eurozone and now the recent decision by the Federal Reserve just last week, we'd be right off the chart here. All that means to you is you're working harder to make the same amount of money to buy less. Said in a whole other way, when you make your money and it sits in the bank and you hear on the news a new bailout has been approved, what that means to you is the money that's sitting in your bank has just become worth less. And if you're not using your money proactively and getting that money to work for you, then that money is actually losing its value overnight. It's what's called a stealth tax. Yes?
I was going to say that people who are scared and put their money in the bank is actually, they're causing the entire, they're really hurting themselves. It's shooting yourself in the foot because you are partially responsible for the devaluation.
Yeah, absolutely. We all are responsible. That's why I'm not one of these guys called get rid of the government. I'm one of these guys called, okay, let's point the finger here. We're responsible. Now what are we going to do about it? But you're absolutely right. Everybody who's putting their money in the bank, we're contributing to the whole system proliferating. Right? But I'll never tell anybody don't put your money in the bank, because sometimes you got to put your money in the bank. All I tell people is, if you're putting money in the bank, be sure that you're using it at some point during that month to make money some way. Okay, and then move it into other things that have some real intrinsic value, like Jeff was talking about.